Good morning and welcome. In just a few moments, we'll begin our program. But before we do, I first want to remind you to please turn off your cell phone. If you're able to, I'm going to invite you to please rise. We're in the month of Elul, and Dr. Fred Brownstein is going to sound the shofar for us as we prepare for the high holy days. Please be seated. The sounding of the shofar, according to rabbinic tradition, is an alarm clock. It is an attempt to remind us that in the month of Elul, it's a good time to do some reflecting and thinking about where we've been and about how we've behaved and about what ways we've missed the mark in the year that passed and how we might do better in the year to come. In a certain way, I feel like the Foggle lecture series is a different version of the shofar, and that when Bill and Lynn came and talked with me so many years ago about this lecture series, Bill said, I want someone to talk about the critical issues that society ought to be reckoning with. And I want people to have intellectual conversations about what's right and what's wrong in our world. Now, I'm not going to lie, he didn't use the word shofar. I didn't think of it. But as I thought about our lecture this morning, I thought in a certain sense, the conversation you're going to hear is a little bit like a shofar sounding to say, what's right in our society and what's wrong, and what can we do to move the scale to correct the ways in which we've maybe missed the mark. So I'm really delighted to welcome you to the congregation, and I just want to take this moment to thank Lynn and to really honor Bill's memory. From the get-go, Bill said, Springfield is my home, and Springfield made me who I am, and I will always be indebted to this community, and I will always love it. And when he said that, I just felt chills and felt so grateful that wherever they are, Florida, wherever they are, Springfield has their heart, and I'm grateful to you for that, and welcome home. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Those of you who may not know me, I can't imagine who you are, but I'm Lynn Foggle, and I'm delighted that you're all here today. I send you a hearty welcome and a shout out to all the people who are live streaming us. Grandchildren in Europe, grandchildren in 4 different time zones, and my dear friends in Florida at my home at Sinai Residences. Oh, I'm sorry. When Bill Foggle and I met exactly 71 years ago, we found a common ground in the love of learning and knowing more about the world around us. That partnership and the blessing of being connected to a tradition, a people, and a faith was the cornerstone of our lives together. The Great Issues title of this lecture was derived from a required college course that he took and he believed was life-altering to him. The great speakers came from all walks of life while they were the visiting lecturers. One of them, the philosopher Erich Fromm, was a powerful influence on Bill, and he often quoted the following from The Art of Loving, quote, "Giving is the highest expression of potency. In the act of giving, I experience my strength and power and vitality. It fills me with joy because in the act of giving, I feel my aliveness," unquote. Consequently, it followed for Bill that he dreamt of giving back to this community in which he was born and raised and lived his entire life. the gift of discussing and learning about the great issues of the day. Now, with the help of our children, his dream is alive and well, and as you will learn today from our esteemed speaker, but she's going to be introduced by Rabbi Mark Cohn, so I'll turn this over to him.
Thank you, Lynn. Boker Tov, good morning. Thank you, Lynn, and to your family for arranging last night's evening and this morning's talk with Ayaan, Hirsi. I'm deeply honored to introduce our speaker and then serve as the moderator later. By way of just logistics, following Ayaan's opening words, we will open up to questions. I'll offer a couple of questions. We're going to collect questions on cards that you have, and then we'll kind of sift through them and bring them forward. The first time I read the words of Ayaan Hirsi was most likely on the pages of a previous Foggle lecture speaker, Barry Weiss. In December of 2021, the Free Press, and I think it was still called Common Sense at the time, published the words of Ayaan Hirsi. As a group of writers were reflecting on the close of that year, Ayaan, you spoke of the need for liberalism to stand up and defend itself against the more muscular ideologies like Islamism and populism. Now note, liberalism, which is very much not progressive politics. Liberalism is how we create a society, equality of men and women, rule of law, the superiority of liberty and democracy over other forms of government. Ayaan's story starts long before that article, and long before this moment when we get to find you here in Western Massachusetts. Ayaan's story starts in Somalia in 1969. She moved to the Netherlands in 1992, and by 2002 had managed to learn Dutch and earn a master's degree at the University of Leiden. She would go on to serve in the Netherlands Parliament from 2003 to 2006. Since then, until now, there are books, articles, countless teaching, interviews, and more. She was the founder of the Ayaan Hirsi Foundation in 2007 to promote liberty and Western values, and most recently, this past spring, the Substack Restoration Bulletin, which seeks to restore the critical idea of unity under and within which we can find and rediscover the value, the importance of nation, family, religion, and active, engaged, serious citizenship. She's a fellow at the Hoover Institute in Stanford University, has taught and written for the Kennedy School in Harvard, and of course the American Enterprise Institute as well. Ayaan, you are someone who is, to play with a name that we give to God among our morning prayers, you are a notenet koach. You are someone who gives strength. Your honesty, your insight, your willingness to go out on a limb for women, for Jews, for what is right, for liberalism, you give others like me and this room full of people and far beyond here the strength to speak, to write, and to advocate. Thank you, and may God only continue to give you further insight, strength, and conviction. Ladies and gentlemen, Ayaan Hirsi.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Rabbi Mark, and thank you very much, Lynn Foggle, for everything you and your family have done. I want to start by asking you if you can hear me. Yeah, perfect. I'm going to tell, as is advertised, talk a little bit about the Holocaust and the Holocaust, teaching about the Holocaust curriculum. And after that little anecdote, we're going to have a lengthy conversation. Let me start by saying that if my mother knew right now that I was at a synagogue, she would have a heart attack. And the anecdote I wanted to tell you is an encounter with my half-sister in 1994. My half-sister is called Ichabo, and she's about 2.5 years younger than I am. And we had just been accepted into the Netherlands as asylum seekers. I had come in 1992. I think she had come in that year, 1994. I wanted to learn Dutch. I wanted to go to university, so part of the requirement was that I take a test in Dutch language in civics and an introduction to history. And it is in 1994, at the age of 24, during the preparation for that history course, that I first found out about the Holocaust. I had never heard, I had been to school, but I had never heard of the Holocaust. Just imagine that. Now, having learned about the Holocaust, all I did was just be shocked. Because in 1992, I come to the Netherlands via Germany, and I find these incredible societies, beautiful, well organized, clean, the order, the freedom. I was wowed. But of course, I had no idea that there was this dark history behind it. At the time, to their credit, the Dutch were teaching that history, and it was required not just of Dutch children, but of anyone who wanted to make their way through the education system. The effect the story of the Holocaust had on me was one of horror, but also one of hope. Because I don't know if you remember, but in 1994, the genocide in Rwanda was underway. So why hope? It was, if these societies were capable of doing something as horrific as the Holocaust, and they've come out of it, we too can come out of that. When my half-sister comes to visit me, I tell her, and she actually lived in Somalia, so she was exposed to the civil war, and the civil war is one clan trying to genocide another clan. They just didn't have the technology, and they didn't live in a society advanced enough to carry things out the way Hitler did. So I say to my half-sister, look at this book, look at this story, just look how horrible this is. And I'm showing her pictures of the skeletons of children. Remember the piles and piles of bones of the children. And she looks at me and she says, in our family, you've always been the stupidest and most naive. This is what the Jews do. They invent these stories so they can manipulate stupid little minds like yours. There was no way I was going to convince my half-sister of what was historically documented and in front of her, because she was steeped, marinated in this hatred for Jews. And I'll take you back when I was a little girl, 6 or 7 years old, living in Saudi Arabia. My mother, my grandmother, all the family members would blame Jews for everything that went wrong. Whether it had anything to do directly with Israel or not, I'm not sure I had heard of Israel. I should have, but I was little. One of the memories I talk a lot about is my mother went to the sink and opened the tap. And you know when the tap coughs out because there's no water or the water has been shut down, she goes, "It's the Jews, they've been at it again." And every time there is news of war, of disease, of a natural disaster, it became commonplace to say, it's the Jews that are behind it. That is the background I grew up in. In 1985, I joined the Muslim Brotherhood. They came to our school. The Muslim Brotherhood is an Islamist movement, for those of you who don't know it. It started in 1920 in Germany. It started in Egypt, and then it proliferated from Egypt and is today in almost every country in the world. And living in Nairobi, Kenya in 1985, members of the Muslim Brotherhood came, penetrated our schools, our neighborhoods, and our mosques, and started to tell us that as Muslims, we were not practicing Islam the way it should be practiced. So they introduced Wahhabi Salafi Islam to us, who maybe I would say, if I were to give a name to the Islam we practiced, I would say it was folks. You know, you identify as a Muslim, you pray, sometimes you don't pray. Some women cover themselves, usually if they're a little older. Some women don't cover themselves. Being a Muslim, before the Muslim Brotherhood came to us, was just part of many identities we had. What the Muslim Brotherhood did was it made it the single most important identity. And with the message of the Muslim Brotherhood came a new and virulent hatred for Jews, for Israel. And not just have the hatred in your house. So when we were in the mosque, a place of worship, we would collectively pray for the destruction of Jews. But it was for young men to actually get up and do something about it, find Jews and kill them. We were reading verses from the Quran that I didn't know were in the Quran. Like, behind every rock hides a Jew. They are monkeys. Don't take them as your friends. Destroy them wherever you find them. And the hadith, the various most gruesome ways in which the Prophet had killed the first tribe of Jews that he encountered in Medina, and that is the example, and forever for the rest of life until we defeat them and overpower them completely, that is what we should do. In this age of globalization, when you have millions of people coming from Muslim-majority countries, inadvertently, you have people like my half-sister and me who were steeped in this hatred for Jews that happened in mosques and in madrasas and on television, and then, of course, lately with social media and the internet in a much more amplified way than in the 1980s and in the 1990s. And as these people cross the border, no one asks them, well, now that you've entered the Netherlands, will you shed your hatred for the Jews? It doesn't work that way. What the Dutch were doing in 1984, that was the right thing to do, which was to just require of everyone who is going through the education system to be introduced to the Holocaust. Some people would have reacted like me, be horrified and reject all hatred of Jews and all hatred of other people. Because the lesson of the Holocaust is not just to stop the hatred of Jews, it's to stop the hatred of your fellow humans, because you degrade and descend into that kind of evil. So some people might take away from a required lesson in the Holocaust the lesson that I took. And some people might resist it, like my half-sister, and say, no. But I think it is wrong to have succumbed to the people who said, and I'm talking about the Netherlands now, fast forward to the 2000s, when I became involved in politics and I became involved in policy discussions. I worked for a think tank for the Social Democratic Party, and then later on I went into parliament for the Centre-Right Party. And there was pressure on the government, on the local government, on the regional governments, and on the national government to stop the required bit so that the Holocaust could be voluntary. You take it if you want it, you don't have to take it if you don't. Just make it not mandatory. The argument that was made was, we have a minority of Muslim children who feel intense pain because of the situation in the Middle East, the confrontation between the Israelis and the Palestinians. And using that argument, we were told, let us drop the Holocaust education from schools. There were arguments back and forth. There were really some well-intentioned people who were saying, we want to make these young Muslim communities be a part of our community, so let's drop it. And the other side was, but how will they ever know? In order to make them part of Dutch history, it's very important for them to know what we did. And the reason we teach the history of the Holocaust is so as never to repeat it again. Never again. That is not how it worked out. The Holocaust education was dropped. And you know, when you drop it for one group, what happens? Other groups also say, but why me? And so, incredibly, in 1994, you could never imagine on the streets of Amsterdam, The Hague, Utrecht, Rotterdam, groups of people shouting, from the river to the sea, death to the Jews, Hamas, Hamas, Jews to the gas. And today it's commonplace. You shrug it off. Do you remember the Anne Frank house? Anne Frank house was a memorial of the Holocaust. You go there today and they say it's a symbol against the Holocaust, anti-Semitism, and Islamophobia. So Islamophobia, this term that is concocted, which is part of a vocabulary to bring down the state of Israel, is uttered in one breath with anti-Semitism. And if the situation in Holland is bleak for Jews, it's not better in the United Kingdom. It's not better in France. It's not better in Germany. This is what you're looking at. And in 2024, actually 2023, after October 7 of last year, you woke up to the fact that it is not that much better in America. Look at the campuses. The most advanced universities in the 21st century in America, with students coming out, and in this confrontation between good and evil, siding with evil, wearing the symbols of Hamas. They tell you that this is a Palestinian flag. It is not. It's a flag of Hamas. The slogans they are shouting, these are Hamasi slogans. It is not to tell you, it is not about the people of Gaza. If they cared about the people of Gaza, if they cared about the children and the women and the citizens of Gaza, October 7 would not have happened. The Abraham Accords would have held. It is not about the children of Gaza. It is a messianic, fanatical, religious conviction that doesn't see the Israeli-Palestinian confrontation as a territorial dispute. It sees it as a religious obligation to destroy the state of Israel, to destroy Jewishness. Because that's what is taught in the mosque, it's taught in the school. As Mohammed Morsi, the first Muslim Brotherhood president of Egypt, who reigned for 1 year, he was caught on tape saying, "Let us nurse, breastfeed our children with the hatred for Jews." He was caught on video saying that. And that's exactly what happens. And that is why, ladies and gentlemen, I think, at least in the West, it's highly important that we bring back the story of the Holocaust and that it is required reading. It's part of every curriculum from the age that children are capable of understanding something like that. That should be an effort that we make. I'll leave you with this and say, Rabbi Mark, let's have the conversation. I'm sure lots of people are full of questions for that. Thank you.
Is it okay? We're good.
Yes.
Thank you for those introductory words. My goodness, there's a lot of questions, I'm sure, and a lot of reactions to everything that you just said. And I couldn't help but think about, some folks may know the local story of what happened here just within the last month. There was to be an organization called Project Shema that works on teaching anti-Semitism in schools to be obligatory training for the school district up in Northampton. 500 people signed on to not allow Project Shema to come and teach, and that it should not be obligatory for the Northampton schools. And the Northampton School District said, oh, yes, okay, it's not obligatory. It's the same thread of what you're talking about here. So, as kind of an opening question, so what do we do? Like, how do we respond when we're watching an ideology that has become so insipid and shows up in K through 12 education, clearly in college education as well, that the battle that Israel is fighting right now and that Jews are fighting right now is one that's not from this exact era. It dates back decades. Really, your point about the Muslim Brotherhood, and this is a 120 years long war, and it's an ideology. So how do we fight an ideology like that?
So, Rabbi Mark, when we were in the green room on the way here, you quoted another rabbi, Rabbi David, and he made a distinction. You said
He'd love to say he was a rabbi. He's not. A Jewish professional, absolutely.
okay. So this Jewish professor or professional
Yeah.
Jewish professor, you quoted him as saying, as making a distinction between right wing or far right anti-Semitism and far left anti-Semitism, where I just love that image of the far right anti-Semitism. He said is a heart attack. It kills you instantly. The left-wing anti-Semitism is like a cancer. You don't know you have it. It's insidious. It takes a long time. And I think the big challenge, the reason why the Holocaust lessons were removed or the teachings of anti-Semitism are cast aside, that's because of left-wing anti-Semitism. Because it's presented in this compassionate language. Drop the Holocaust from the curriculum because these poor little children, they get hurt. Their feelings get hurt. They can't handle all of these other things that are going on. So this language that is deployed by the left, that's shrouded in compassion, shrouded in goodness and nicety, I think the first thing that you have to do is expose it. That is how to fight the anti-Semitism that creeps in through the far left ideology. The Islamist-driven anti-Semitism and Jew hatred, that one is not covered up. It's in your face. They quote, they cite from scripture, they cite from the Quran, they tell you this is how the Prophet dealt with Jews. And then they have all these plans and programs that they put into place. And just the sheer dedication. The Islamist-driven anti-Semitism doesn't only dedicate money and time and effort and weapons, they dedicate their own children to it. There are scenes of little kids, 5-year-olds, being strapped with explosives so that they can go and blow themselves up. The child can go and blow himself up. Again, I don't know whose quote it is, but it is, as long as they hate the Jews more than they love their children, this problem is going to be with us. So that is pure, explicit evil. But the only thing that's interesting in 2024 is this alliance, this red-green alliance, the alliance between the Islamist-driven anti-Semites and the leftist anti-Semites. And that's the one that I think when you feel horribly betrayed, especially if you think of yourself as a liberal. Yeah.
It's Golda Meir who had that quote. And it's one that we often stand up and say, Israel does not, or we don't want to fight. But if it's a matter of survival, then we simply have to. I just want to note that if people want to write questions on cards, Rabbi Amy is going to come around to collect them, and we'll get a chance to ask some questions as well. When we think about, I want to play with the shofar. I'm not going to play the shofar. I'm not going to that Fred so beautifully did this morning. When we look at the shofar, there's a lot of symbolism in this ram's horn, and when we think about where we blow the shofar from, we blow it from the narrow side, from the small part, and then it brings a big sound on the outside of that. That is used symbolically to talk about the idea of Jews as a particularistic people with a universal message. Right? You have to believe, because if you try to go the other direction, from the universal side, you get nothing out of it. It's a mess. What has happened with Holocaust education is our particular story has been universalized. And when people come along and say, it can happen to anybody, yes, genocide absolutely can happen in any number of places, and yet our story is a particular one, and anti-Semitism is different than any other hatred. Can you break apart why that word Islamophobia? Because they often get paired. As soon as someone says something, we're going to teach about anti-Semitism, now we've got to teach about Islamophobia as well. Even when the White House held a whole conference on anti-Semitism, they only issued the ultimate information to declare about opposition to Islamophobia. Why is that word problematic? It's not that, of course we don't want there to be hatred against Muslims, but why is that word problematic?
No, you have to go back to the history of the word. it dates back to 1979, Iran, Ayatollah Khomeini taking over control of that country, becoming part of the United Nations, getting introduced to this concept of the universal human rights, and then the campaigns, the ideas campaigns that the West, led by America, was waging for universal human rights. And what Khomeini so cleverly understands is, and this is maybe for a different time, but if you look at Islamist discourse, Islamists have an objective, and the objective is to Islamize the entire world. There are areas where they agree and disagree on how to get to that objective. One of the ways of getting there is through violence and jihad, which, as you remember, Al-Qaeda and ISIS and all of these others, they cite the Prophet Muhammad during the time of Medina, and they say we can just frighten them and we shock and awe, we are going to Islamize the whole world. But there is a more rational, intelligent side of the Islamist wing who say, no, you have to work more slowly and you have to work through institutions. In fact, I think Ayatollah Khomeini did exactly that. He took advantage of an existing grievance, a universal grievance against the Shah, and that is how he came to power. Now, operating on the international scene, and within that United Nations institution, the word Islamophobia was devised to, I'd say it's a very effective tool of censorship. It tries to compose a unified grievance that Muslims hold against those who colonized them, against those who had done them an injustice, and then equate it with anti-Semitism and say Jewish people have, there's nothing really special about a hatred for Jews. We've also been hated, and this is Islamophobia. Now, what is wrong with this one? There was never any unified Muslim anything. Muslims live in different countries, different regions of the world, speak different languages, and have different outlooks. And besides that, there are also very many different ethnic groups. There are Arabs and Indians and so on and so forth. And there never ever was a campaign anywhere in the world to eliminate Muslims for just being Muslim. There have been at least 2,000-year-old campaign to eliminate Jews for no other reason than just being Jews. That's the story of the Holocaust. So there is no similar story of ever wanting to eliminate any Muslim group for just being Muslim. But what the term, it's a psychological tool that shuts down any kind of conversations that Westerners bring if the conversation is opened by trying to push human rights, universal, or the rights of women, or the rights of this group. If I want to talk about how women are treated in Islam, I'll be shut down with the term Islamophobia. How gays are treated in the Muslim world will be shut down with Islamophobia. If you want to talk about the treatment of the minorities in Muslim countries, it's going to be shut down with. So it's a tool of censorship. It's a psychological tool. It's been effective. It's constantly tried and lobbied, and it has worked incredibly. It's been so effective that in America, we now have, again, in one sentence, we should fight against both anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. That's the biggest slap in the face of the Jewish people and Jewish history.
Can you break it down? And this would be a class in and of itself on the history of Islam, the different aspects of it. We hear these terms, Shiite Muslim and Sunni Muslim. So this is one of the questions we've had from the audience today is, how do we work with, when we know with the Abraham Accords, where we had largely Sunni Muslim countries, if I'm getting this right, who made this connection with Israel in this really powerful, important relation over the last couple of years. why is it more likely that there would be a Sunni Muslim country that would connect with Israel as opposed to a Shia, understanding that the Hamas are Sunni? And is it just a matter of realpolitik? And that's why these countries, like, what do we do with that? And we don't have an entire 4-week class to do this.
Yeah, so this is it. So the class again would begin in around 1920 when the Ottoman Empire falls apart. Please read, it's a very small book. It's called What Went Wrong, and it's written by the late British historian Bernard Lewis. What Went Wrong? And he starts there. So Islam was an empire, and it collapses. Many empires, rise and then plateau and then decline and fall, and that happens to Islam. And the last empire was ruled by the Ottomans. And then there's this big argument between the Muslim leaders and especially the clergymen. Why did we fall? And they go in two different directions. Kemal Atatürk, who's the most famous in these conversations, says, because we weren't paying attention and we lag behind when it comes to technology, to military, to medicine, and the way forward is to copy the West. And he establishes a nation state. The concept of a nation state is a Western concept. And this is how Turkey comes about, and later on other nation states are established. Not many of them actually succeeded. The other side say, no, we failed because we drifted away from the basics of what the Prophet Muhammad did in Medina, and so we have to go back to pure Sharia law, we have to go back to pure Islam. And it's this group, the Islamists, political Islamists, who are engaged in this concept of Islamizing their own society. That's on a very local level, and then on the regional level, and some of them have got global ambitions. And so, again, to go back to the concept of Islamophobia and the Sunni Shia difference, on the Sunni Shia just means when the Prophet Muhammad died, he didn't have a blueprint for who's going to succeed him. And when he dies, they have these discussions on who's going to take over. And the Sunnis are the ones who say, we're going to select the best among us to lead us. And the Shia are the ones who say, no, we need someone, a bloodline from the Prophet Muhammad. And he didn't have sons, so it was a daughter, so it would have to be Ali, the Prophet's bloodline. So that was the first schism. Forget about that one. We're not going to get into it. You can read up on it. But by 1979, when Khomeini, who is a Shia, Iran was a Shia country, takes control, I think in some ways it's an affront to the Sunnis, especially Saudi Arabia, which is, that's where Mecca and Medina are, that's where the Hijaz is, that's where 1 billion Muslims pray to, and they weren't going to be left behind. And so the Saudis, there's an attack in 1979 on the mosque in Mecca. They try to overthrow the Saudi government. They fail. And in return, unfortunately, the Saudi government of that time starts to fund Islamization across the world. And that is through soft power. And with that Islamization went, the Jewish hatred and hatred for Israel, and all these political things are happening along. So the Sunni Islamization project has got two heads. One is state-led, oil money funded across the world. The other one is these NGOs like the Muslim Brotherhood, Hizb ut-Tahrir, the Deobandi, all of these different movements that are not necessarily tied to a state, often get money, get funding from states, get hosted by states and the like. But that was pretty much the Sunni approach. And the Shia approach became pretty much, within Iran and Iran's proxies, now Hezbollah, Hamas, and the Houthis. I don't know if this is very enlightening, but this is just sort of a sketchy picture of where the Sunnis and the Shias differ in their competition to Islamize first the Middle East and then the rest of the world. Then something happens during the first Trump administration. The Abraham Accords come along. And Saudi Arabia has now changed, as a government, has changed its program of Islamization. Saudi Arabia, as a government, is not spending money on the Wahhabization of Indonesians, Pakistanis, Africans, and Europeans. That's not what they're doing. They're building glittering cities in Saudi Arabia, and they want to become the world's coolest place for young people. They're investing money in golf tournaments and concerts and whatever, and soccer. And they came very willingly to take part in these Abraham Accords and were ready to acknowledge or recognize Israel. And in fact, de facto, in some ways, they have. But the country to watch is the UAE, the United Arab Emirates, another Sunni country. And that country is really leading in, very openly shedding all its Islamist credentials. They are not Islamist anymore. They have recognized Israel. There are synagogues in the UAE. There are Christian churches. And they openly and wholeheartedly condemned what Hamas did on October the 7th. So you have this mixed picture. Now, when I tell you about the Shias and where the Shia are, the Islamist regime of Iran is Shia, and in the name of Shia Islam, wants to be the first to destroy Israel. But the good news is that they do not have the blessing and the endorsement of a majority of the Iranian population. Another feature about Shia Islam is it's usually more moderate than Sunni Islam. So at this point, I would say I don't really know of these non-governmental Shia Islamist movements. Hezbollah is not entirely non-governmental, whereas there are all of these independent movements across the world that are Sunni and that are radical and that are seeking to. I hope I haven't confused you more than I have enlightened you, but it's a pretty complex picture.
As is life with humans, and all the more so. But that book that you mentioned by What Went Wrong by Bernard Lewis sounds like a must-read.
And there are other books. I probably should send you a list.
That's actually not a bad idea as a follow-up, as a bibliography for today. Some of the questions have focused on or brought in ideas about liberalism and how to protect liberalism, and what are components that are threatening liberalism. And if we want to talk about that kind of in the West as a whole, things that were mentioned here is what happens with immigration from Muslim countries, and what do we do with DEI, with the program of diversity, equity, inclusion. So I've included a few different questions in that, but the overarching theme is, what do we do with liberalism? How do we protect it? And I'll put in a little slide here also of that sometimes liberalism, if taken to its extreme, can actually lead to its demise. So how do we protect these fundamental ideas that you're?
So I think you trace liberalism back to its foundational roots, and liberals, individuals who responded to situations in Europe back in the day and who were asking critical questions critical of the way these systems were set up, these feudal systems were set up, how people were excluded, how individuals had no choice, where there was a concentration of power, and they were arguing for checks and balances. They were arguing for all sorts of what you would call finding that balance between liberty and order. But one key component of liberalism is that critical thinking. It's the individual and its individual choice. So if you have, it doesn't matter if they dress themselves up as liberals and say, I'm a liberal, but if you're being told you can't ask questions, then you're not sitting in front of a liberal. You're sitting in front of an ideology. If these people are presenting themselves as spokespeople for groups, where the group interest is placed above the interest of the individuals within those groups, then you're dealing with an illiberal force. So these people who call themselves progressives in America and liberals in America, they don't meet the textbook definition of liberalism. And I think any scholar of liberalism will tell you that, but unfortunately, these labels have been hijacked. And this, what I see right now, is communism or Marxism or Leninism dressed up as liberalism. It's the ideology that we used to fight that has come back and subverted us and is calling itself progressive. It's not progressive. I don't think Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's politics and policies are liberal. I don't think Ilhan Omar's are liberal. They don't understand it. Or they do understand it, but they also understand that by using the word liberal, they're more effective in getting what they pursue. And so you have to wait, you have to take back the language, the English language, the German language, the French language, whatever. Take back the language of the common people so that we don't speak their language. Diversity, equity, and inclusion is a very nice sounding scheme. Who could possibly be against it? Again, that takes me back to the person whom you quoted, David, the cancer versus the heart attack. It's shrouded in this language of justice and compassion and inclusion, but it's the opposite of what it is. The Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at Harvard excludes Jews and excludes individuals who voice any kind of criticism against whatever the agenda is of the radical leftists. It's exclusionary, it's divisive, it cuts society up into these sections. It tells us there are oppressors and there are oppressed. And the oppressor is a white, heterosexual male. This is a formal reintroduction of racism. And I'm supposed to take part in that? No. Why are you mentioning their skin color? What's up with the skin color? Then they have all this perverted history of it's the white male heterosexual who is responsible for slavery, for segregation, for the Holocaust, for all of that. Yes, some white heterosexual men were responsible for all that, but there are other white heterosexual men who fought that and who paid the price for it. And can I also point out, where are the black heterosexual males who fought slavery and segregation in Africa? What about the Arabs? What about the Chinese? See, I would like to have these discussions, but in the name of diversity, equity, inclusion, you can't have them because you can't question the ideology. And anything that you cannot question is not liberalism. It can't pretend to be liberal. Liberalism was all about, it was based on that critical thinking. Liberalism is not an ideology. It really is a cluster of an attitude. It's a critical, intellectual, and cognitive attitude to the way society is. And it is an appraisal of different ideas and ideologies. That's what liberalism was about. But it isn't sort of a packaged prescription for what society should and should not do. It's a criticism of, you say this, but I have a different perspective. And almost always, liberals will try to seek the middle ground. And I think that is the problem, is that when you're confronted with pure evil, there is no middle ground. And that is at its core the weakness with liberalism, is this it's a good one, it's a noble one, to try and always achieve solutions through consensus and through the middle ground until you're confronted with real evil. And then you really have to triumph over it. Go back to the history of the Second World War.
And that actually pulls us back to what you were talking about earlier, that when they took away the curriculum of Holocaust studies in the Netherlands, part of what liberalism opens up the door for is to be self-reflective and to highlight what we've done wrong, which on the one hand, for us as Americans, to look back at what happened with slavery in this country, of course we need to look back at that. But when that becomes the primary story, then we lose the very foundation that makes this country a great country.
So it's that hierarchy of values. Liberalism preaches tolerance. To be a liberal, you have to be tolerant of the ideas and practices of other people, or at least you have to try to aspire to be tolerant of. So that is one value. The other value is obviously to recognize, even when you see it, and there you recognize you can't compromise with it. And so initially, I'll say, when these encounters started to happen, the European leadership, the American leadership were, but it's okay, if these kids are getting upset, it's okay, we'll just drop the Holocaust. Maybe at some other point they'll learn about it. It sounds so reasonable. But the thing I think that they neglected to do, and there is no reason to do it today, back in the day you could use the excuse of not knowing or not having tried something out, but they couldn't do that today. Is you are confronted with an ideological agenda. And the people who are advancing this ideological agenda, they are the ones who are saying, drop the Holocaust. We need a separate school for Muslim students. Muslim students in Holland, in all over Europe, they're left behind. You shouldn't be isolating them in ghettos. If you want to lift up Muslim students, you should put them in with the rest of society. But somebody with an ideology has this agenda. And so as a liberal, I think you do have to step back and you have to say, who's talking to me? Who is this person and what do they want? That's critical thinking. And I think most liberals have dropped that constant vigilance and that constant state of mind of critical thinking. Ask questions. They don't ask questions. They want to conform. Why do you want to conform? Because you hate trouble. You hate confrontation. You don't want to be confronting people all the time. I get that. But I think now we are in a place where we actually do have to confront. So we can preserve what we have. We don't have to invent a new wheel. We have these things. We have these structures. It really is a restoration of these ideas and what we believe in, and to have these conversations.
So when we look at institutions that exist in our world, and this is a little bit of echoed in another question, and the book I had, before we were starting today, I shared a book with Ayaan by David Bernstein of the Jewish Institute for Liberal Values. Full disclosure, I work for him. And that's one of the other kippot. One of my kippot that I wear is I'm the Rebbitzin of Temple Beth El in Springfield. So what he talks about in his book, Woke Anti-Semitism, and comes up is this idea, what do we do with the institutions, though, that are already in place, whether it's Harvard, Columbia, our local school district, the United Nations, that bring in ideologies of DEI or bring in certain perspectives? Do we just abandon those institutions all the way? Do we try to work from within? How do we respond?
It's
and DEI is totally different than the United Nations, and yet it has to do with institutional structure.
It's the conversations we are having all across America and all across Europe now, where we see institutions that have been compromised, and the decay is inside. It has spread, and I would say, in that sense, depending on the community who's there, you have to start appraising every institution separately. Is Harvard as far gone as we think it is? Is Penn U in some ways better than Harvard? You've been following Bill Ackman's, wrestling with Harvard, and every institution has a board of governors. They have alumni. They have donors, the so-called stakeholders, students, parents, people who pay school fees. There were some people in Wall Street, employers, who were saying, students who display these forms of intolerance and stupidity, we're not going to hire them. So I think you have to look at every institution separately to decide, is it salvageable or does it have stage 4 cancer? If it has stage 4 cancer, let it die, or close it down so that it doesn't spread it. I also think it's inevitable to start new institutions. My husband, Neil Ferguson, has worked with Joe Lonsdale and others, very wise, to establish the University of Texas. And it is in Austin, it's the University of Austin. So it was UATX, the University of Austin in Texas, but it's accredited now, so it's the University of Austin. And it is... it's had its vast set of students, and it can be like the University of Chicago once was, that institution on the hill that can show the other institutions, look, we can do it, because you'll see students and professors and faculty and money flowing towards the new institution. Something like that can be a force for good. It can be an incentive for the existing institutions to get their act together. I'm only talking about universities at the moment because that's the world I run around in. But then you mentioned the United Nations. And I think that the United Nations is unsalvageable. I think the United Nations and many of its agencies are gone, really gone. You'll have, yeah. And here's another thing, is we really do have to have the courage sometimes to look at something and think, no, the termites within the United Nations that have eaten into all the structures have been so successful, it's on the brink of collapse. You have the Human Rights Agency in the United Nations that is manned and chaired by countries like Iran and Venezuela. I mean, it is a joke. And they come up with all these crazy resolutions. So first, take Israel and Israel's campaign against Hamas today. First, there is this United Nations demand that Israel wage the war, which in my view is a righteous war, according to a certain set of rules that are impossible to meet, and only Israel is held to that. But okay, Israel does that. Then we get the Operation Nuts is what I call it, which is this the peepers, what is that device?
The pagers?
The pagers, yeah, the pagers, and then the walkie-talkies. And the United Nations comes out and says, but you're killing children, you're doing this, you're doing that. This was a surgical attack. It went only after the fighters, so there is nothing Israel can do in this. What United Nations? All they do is just produce these resolutions that are anti-American, anti-Israel, anti-Western, but happily take all this Western money. So what we have to do is just defund the United Nations. We have to start from scratch.
To start to close our time together, which has just been remarkable to get to be with you. And when you started your comments earlier, I was just sinking in the chair. I'm like, oh my God, this story when you told about your half-sister and this, what happens, how ideas just get embedded in a society that people just think that, of course, the Jews are behind this, right? And yet, you have this remarkable courage, and your writing that you do on restoration and elsewhere is inspiring and gives hope. Where are you looking, or what do you see as the places of hope, and say, yeah, all is not lost at all. Like, we're going to be all right. Or please tell us if we're going to be all right. How can you send us off on this day?
Yeah. Well, I started with the comparison with my half-sister. And so when the idea spread, when I learned about the Holocaust, it changed my mind. I liberated myself from the propaganda against Jews that I was marinated in all my life. She did not. And now if you look across the internet, I see Arabs, I see Iranians, Persians, I see Indonesians, I see loads and loads of Muslims that when they get the information, this is why freedom of speech is so important, so you can spread the ideas worth spreading, that you will find minds, reasonable minds, when they look at the information, they think, I've been lied to. I've been a victim of propaganda. I've been hoodwinked. I don't believe in this anymore. And suddenly the world is a better place. And suddenly, when you're told over and over again, you don't control your life, there is some Jewish force around you that makes you fail your exams, keeps you poor, fills you up with diseases, etc. And you discover, no, they're just normal people. And Jews are human beings like all of us. Some of them are smart, some of them are stupid, some of them are tall, some of them are short, some of them are weak, some of them are strong. They're just fellow human beings, and they don't have any of these powers, that magical, Harry Potter type powers. They don't. That's liberating for the person who gets to understand, I can take agency. I can take back my life. I can take back my society. That's what the UAE has done as a country. They have stopped blaming Israel for their problems. That's exactly what the Saudis are doing. They've decided we'll stop blaming the Jews for what's going on. And it will give an opportunity to the Egyptians and the Tunisians and the Iranians and everybody else. So I'm really, really hopeful. Go on X and you're going to find loads and loads of Arabs coming out. There were Arabs who cheered this operation against Hezbollah with the pages. And some of the language they used was, it's not what Israel did to Hezbollah does not only benefit Israel, it benefits us Arabs in Lebanon who are trapped under this. So I'm very, very hopeful. It really is a matter of just finding the courage to stand up and be willing to have these difficult discussions. I know they're difficult, but you've got to stand up for what is right while we're still at the stage of conversations, because it can only get worse if we stay silent.
With that message of hope and of opportunity and liberalism, we thank you very much, Ayaan, for your presence here.
And I just want to take a moment. I want to thank Lynn. I want to remember Bill. I would thank John and Lily and Andrea and Doug and the Foggle family for remembering where home is, and may you always feel that way. Thank you all for being here. Just a reminder, there is I don't think you're allowed to have dessert before noon, but there's a lovely reception with something sweet, and that's in the atrium. We'd love for you to join us there. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Welcome. Thank you.
So wonderful.
Yeah.